I'm Sylvia Paull. I've been on the board of this wonderful place that was founded 125 years ago by 3 women. Yeah, I got you there. And women didn't have the vote until 1911 in California and later for the nation, so they had to get their husbands to join the club. And this club did not have a woman president for 25 years. And here I am sitting next to the first woman president of the University of California at Berkeley. She was the first woman president in 149 years. Can you believe it? So where are you from, New Jersey?
I'm from New Jersey. I was born in New York City, and although I was conceived in California, my parents were both in the military. They both volunteered for World War II. They met in a military training camp in Palm Beach, and they eloped to San Francisco to get married, and shortly thereafter my mother became pregnant with me and had an honorable discharge. But I grew up mostly in New Jersey.
Where in New Jersey?
In Bergen County, just northwest of New York City.
Okay. And you went to an all-women's college.
I went to an all-women's college. I went to Douglas College, which doesn't exist any longer except as a residential campus, but it was the women's college. It's kind of the equivalent of Radcliffe or Pembroke of Rutgers University. So that's where I went to college.
And why did you want to go to a women's college?
It was what was available for a smart Jersey girl.
And you majored in Victorian literature?
I majored in English, although I began as a major in music, but then I discovered that I wasn't nearly as good a pianist as I thought I was, and so I switched to English.
And what fascinated you about Victorian poetry? I saw you wrote 2 books about Victorian poetry.
It really was a teacher. I had a wonderful, wonderful teacher, actually a freshman composition, and I later took her Victorian literature course. Her name was Janet Buck, and she inspired me with the way in which the Victorians experienced the world. The Victorians were it was the first time in history when people thought of themselves as modern. They thought of themselves as distinctly different from the people who had come
because of
before.
the scientific discoveries? Or?
For example, I think it was Ruskin who said, with every chip of the geologist's hammer, I can feel my faith crumbling away. It was in part that, but it was also industrialization. Huge migration to the cities. It really marks the beginning of our modern world as we know it.
Right. And so you began as a teacher, as a professor here.
Yes, I did.
And how did you get from Victorian poetry into administration?
I started doing the jobs that faculty members often do. I was chair of my department, for example, though my first administrative job has a very long title. Special Assistant to the Chancellor for the Status of Women and Title IX Compliance Coordinator. But I was very deeply committed to women's issues, and this was a fairly new position that had been created. I think I was the second person in that position.
Who was the chancellor then?
That was Mike Heyman.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
And so Mike was the first chancellor I got to know really well. I worked more closely with the vice chancellor, Rod Park, but Mike was, technically he was my boss.
So then you just kept...
And then I was chair of my department. Then I became Dean of Humanities. I liked doing that. Then I became Dean of the College of Letters and Science. This was a point where Berkeley had a 2-provost system, a provost for the professional schools and colleges and a provost for letters and science. The provost for the professional schools and colleges' name was Judd King. Maybe some of you know him. And we used to joke a lot that we were church and state. And then there was, under Changlin Chen, he did a reorganization of the administration and collapsed the two provost positions into a single position, and asked me to be that person. So that was so it was a very gradual, kind of moving through the ranks. People often think Victorian poetry or Victorian literature has nothing to do with running a university. That isn't true.
What's the correlation?
The correlation is, so much of leadership is telling stories, and it's understanding stories. And if you're a student of literature, I know that there are people who studied English at Berkeley and in this audience, because
raise your hand.
And you study narratives, you study stories, and you also learn to be very discerning about language, which is important. And I think it teaches empathy too, studying literature. So I think, people say all the time, oh, what can, Victorian literature possibly have to do with leading a university? But I think it has a fair number of things that it teaches you to be good at that are really useful.
Well, one quality that you have evinced during the past few years is empathy. That's how you were able to handle all the protests, the Gaza protests, the graduate student protests, the People's Park protests. You were able to listen to all sides, right?
Yeah, there was a lesson that I learned. This was really early in my administrative career. There was a young man, student, came to see me. I was chair, very, very angry because we didn't have enough sections of the honors section, honors English, senior honors English, for him to have a place. And he was furious. And I listened to him, and I said to him, gosh, I'm really sorry. If I were in your position, I would feel really angry too. And all of a sudden, he just kind of deflated. He said, that's all I wanted someone to say, is they understood.
Right.
And that was a big lesson for me.
Wow. Why did you go and transfer to Smith for 11 years?
At that point, I'd finished being provost, and I thought I was going to go back to the faculty. I was going to make my career as, continue my career as a faculty member. And then, but I discovered that I really had become someone different. I had really become a leader in higher education, and about that time, Smith started knocking and asking if they could possibly interest me in their presidency. I'd gone to a women's college, and when I got the job at Berkeley, I actually was, I hesitate to confess this to this audience, I was actually really disappointed. I wanted to be at a little New England college. Oh. And I knew my dissertation director would never let me turn down this job. It was just too good a job. But I'd never been west of Philadelphia. It seemed very, if you can take yourself back to the 60s, it just seemed very foreign. And I felt like, what's a girl from New Jersey doing going to California?
What was your first impression of Berkeley?
It was so liberating. I remember passing a woman on the street in one of my early weeks at Berkeley carrying a poinsettia plant. And she said, "Christmas is coming very soon, my dear." And I realized this is a place. I was just talking to a student today in which he was talking about the feeling he has about Berkeley as a student. And he was saying, I just feel like everyone is free to be who they are, try to discover what they can discover. And that was the feeling that I got about Berkeley when I came here. It was, of course, I came here in 1970, the fall of 1970, and that was, there had been revolutionary movements every year before I joined the faculty. In fact, people said, don't even bother preparing the last third of your class. You'll never get to teach it. But that wasn't the case, in fact. So I was very glad I did prepare the last third of my class.
That's great. What do you, oh, yeah, I was going to talk about your 10-year plan. At the Doe Library Donor Luncheon the other week, the new chancellor, Richard Lyons, mentioned that you really focused on a 10-year plan for getting housing for all undergraduates. Right now, only 30% of students at Cal have housing.
Right.
I don't know where the rest live, you know?
Well, it's a real, it creates such hardship for the students.
Right.
The housing, as you all know, is hard to find. It's expensive in Berkeley. Many of them live at a considerable distance, and that really reduces their access to opportunities on the campus, their participation in
So
campus
what's your
life.
10-year plan? How are you going to do it?
We are building on every piece of land that we have. And so you all know, because that was the protest that canceled this meeting when I was chancellor, that we're building on People's Park. That project is on schedule. We have the wonderful new dormitory, the residence hall anchor house that's on Oxford Street that was a gift, the largest gift to the campus. We're going to be building a 23-story residence hall on the corner of Fulton and Bancroft, where there's an old bank building that's now being used as a campus office building. And we have plans for many other housing developments, which it takes a while to realize it, but we have a goal of offering every first-year student 2 years of housing and every transfer student 1 year of housing, and every graduate student 1 year of housing.
Most other UC campuses do that, yeah.
Yeah, they do. And I think it's a real competitive disadvantage for Berkeley, and will become more so as students, are delighted to get into Berkeley, and then they look at housing and they figure out how hard it is to get and how expensive it is.
So a lot of people here are part of the, arts and crafts movement, Berkeley Historical Association. How do you feel about their resistance to removing some of the older buildings for dorms?
I think that Berkeley has to grow in a way that fits its size of population. That I believe that one of the great tragedies of our contemporary life is the amount of homelessness, particularly in California. And it's very simple. The solution to it is housing.
Right.
And and what I felt, I was saying this to someone earlier before we began the program, that I feel that downtown Berkeley has to be much higher and much denser. So it's not that I'm imagining high-rises in this, neighborhood in North Berkeley, but I do think that there are areas in Berkeley where you're not disrupting neighborhoods and you could have much greater density. I think of downtown, I think of along University Avenue as another place that really could use greater density.
Yeah. San Pablo, too. Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely. All right, people, does anyone have a question? Yeah, stand up.
First new college in a long time was under your tenure, and so that's an interesting name. And so, what did you have in mind with that new college?
You mean the name of the college? What's really interesting about this college was the impulse for the major came from students who really demanded it. They started getting really interested in data science, started putting together what's called an, individual major, independent major, and they said, we want a major. And some faculty really joined forces with them. So initially, it was really a joint initiative, certainly not of the administration, but of students and faculty. And as there were, in typical Berkeley fashion, there were lots of committees, and the faculty committees started saying this has to be an independent college. The reason that it's called the College of Computing, Data Science, and Society is the people that were responsible for the founding of the college felt very strongly that though data science rests upon a knowledge of computing, uses of computing, it is brought to bear on an area that's outside of computing. And so the data science major, for example, every student has to have a concentration. And the concentration could be political science, it could be biology, and it has to do with the uses of data science in that particular discipline. So,
To follow up, do you think that artificial intelligence will largely live in that college?
yes, well, it will live every place on campus, but yes, it's going to live in that college. And the name of the building, the Gateway, was supposed to signify that this is a gateway for the whole campus to have access to these incredibly powerful tools. It's an awfully big gateway. I mean, even though I'd seen models for years of this building, I'm startled to see how big it is.
Another question I saw?
And I'm worried, is there any chance it can become a historic landmark, or what can you tell us about the fate of this building?
Well, I can tell you that the building will never come down. It is a historic landmark, and we feel that it's one of the core and most beautiful buildings on the campus. But a problem equally serious to the lack of housing for our students is the lack of money for deferred maintenance. Since Jerry Brown was governor, he eliminated the regular practice of having a bond every 2 years for capital needs for the campuses. And so we have very, very little money that doesn't come from private philanthropy for building. One of the things I did, it was quite controversial, as chancellor, was increased what we call the philanthropic allocation. It's really a gift tax, specifically for deferred maintenance, because we had no fund source for deferred maintenance. So that's really our problem. What we're going to do right next to the Hearst Gymnasium, and it's going to take care of some of the seismic work on the Hearst Gymnasium, is there's going to be a huge new energy plant that's going to use all the different energy technologies, because our cogeneration plant has less than 10 years of life, viable life. And we've gotten a state allocation for that. We're also raising money for it. And it's my hope that that will begin the process. Berkeley is the oldest campus, as you all know, and it has the worst seismic challenge in the system, and yet it's almost impossible to get the legislature to understand the urgency of this issue and to allocate money for this issue. So what we've been trying to do is being very purposeful about the new construction that we're doing. So for example, the Gateway that we were just talking about, the Gateway is going to be a home for several groups of faculty that are in seismically compromised buildings. Or the new building that's going up on the Dwinell parking lot is going to be a location for all the classrooms and advising in Evans. What we're trying to do is empty Evans, department by department and activity by activity, so we can take it down. Nobody's going to shed a tear, I think, for Evans. but the Hearst Gymnasium is an architectural treasure of the campus, and it's very frustrating not to have a fund source to do the renovation and seismic retrofit that it needs.
Where will this new building be? To which side of it? Is the bay side or the hillside?
The building is not, it's not really going to be a building. The energy, I don't know what to call it, plant, I guess. It's going to be underground. It'll be under the field that is currently, you see people playing Frisbee on it. It probably has a name, that field.
I see the new library, Chancellor Lyons mentioned the other week that the new library, the Moffett Library, is being, undergoing reconstruction. And it's not going to open until next year, and it's going to be named the Carol T. Christ Library.
No, not the Center for Connected Learning.
What?
It's still going to be Moffett Library, but it'll be the Center for Connected Learning. So it's where students will be able to go and find all kinds of resources that will,
But your name will be on the building.
yeah.
Any other, okay, over there.
The question is, does the university have anything to do with the biotech development on Hyde Park, Aquatic Park? The answer is no to that question, but two things that may not be visible to you yet is we're going to be building 2 incubators for startups. One having to do with the research that goes on in the Innovative Genomics Institute, that's Jennifer Doudna's CRISPR Institute. The other having to do with climate change startups. And those are going to be, I don't know how many of you drive past University Hall very often, another building no one will mourn when it comes down. But that's going to be demolished. And there are going to be 2 buildings that will be essentially, biotech buildings, both of them, though in different areas. So the university, and then of course the art museum is now become a bioingenuity hub, which is a biotech startup. So we're thinking really hard about that, but we don't have anything to do with the aquatic park development. In terms of what your second question was, can I talk about what's happening with undergraduate education? We have a wonderful new program. It's called the Discovery Program, which tries to give many more students an independent experience of research or community service of some sort. It's one of the things that's going to go into the library. Oh. The Center for Connected Learning is the Discovery Hub, so that students can just come in there and find out what the opportunities are. It's also a website, of course. And so there's that. We have also a wonderful program called Berkeley Connect, which brings entering students together by academic interests to do a beginning, it's a kind of orientation course. We also have, there's the new advising and student service, the advising building, classroom building that's going up. Engineering is also building, putting 2 stories on the top of Bechtel for student services. Letters and Science has a new design that is working to get passed by the appropriate Senate authorities right now for the distribution requirements, essentially. They were trying to approach it in a different way, asking, what does any graduate of letters and science, what capacities should they have developed at the point that they graduate? So those are some of the things that are happening.
Yeah. What are the crucial vulnerabilities of universities today? All higher education, given that what's happening in Washington, right?
Oh, gosh. How long do you have? I think one of we've just seen the chaos of the halt on federal funding that was rescinded, but very, very confusedly rescinded. Everyone is really worried about research and its vulnerability to reductions in the federal budget. If one of your values is keeping America preeminent, you need to support the research enterprise. So I think of that as a huge vulnerability is vulnerability, reduction of funding and disruptions to the federal research funding. The United States has its leadership position in the world in research since the kind of investment in federal funding of research that took place during the Second World War and proceeded after it. So I see that as a huge vulnerability. I see as a second vulnerability the attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's hard for me to understand equity and inclusion. In fact, diversity is as bad words. But I think that there's a wonderful book, there are several wonderful books by Arlie Hochschild, some of you may know, Strangers in Their Own Land, and most recently her book on shame. And she talks, I've been thinking a lot about all the things that make universities, in the eyes of some people in the country, very controversial. And if you think about them, they're diversity, equity, inclusion, affirmative action, the privileged status of endowments. And there's something that these sources of unhappiness have in common, which is the question, to use Arlie's words, of who gets to be first in line. There's a sense that higher education is, particularly the universities that you hear about a lot, like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Berkeley, are extraordinarily privileged places where it's hard for many families to imagine their kids having a chance to go. It's a combination of how expensive it is and also how competitive admission has become. At Berkeley, we have 125,000 applications for about 6,000 places in our freshman class.
Oh my God.
That's really not a healthy situation. And so I think that there are some, I just heard a wonderful lecture this afternoon, the faculty research lecture by Henry Brady. Some of you may know him, former dean of the Goldman School, professor of political science and also public policy. And he was talking about the ways in which polarization has shifted over the last, he was starting in 1970, so probably the last 50 years or so. And the way in which it used to be that there were two different axes of political polarization. One was a sort of lifestyle moral issues, and the other was financial issues. And he says now they're not two separate axes, they're the same axis. And we're a much more, as you all know, polarized country. And the university is both a convenient symbol for this polarization, or for one side of this polarization, but it's also has real things to be concerned about in terms of financing and in terms of opportunity for students. The question is about the relative funding of the sciences and humanities, and what do I have to say in relationship to people who are really concerned that the sciences get a lot of funding, the humanities less so. And I said that the sciences are an extraordinarily expensive enterprise, and that's part of the issue. I think one of the things that we have done, which is to me really interesting, but it's not free of dangers, is that we rely much more heavily on philanthropy for funding than we ever did. And one of the things that was fascinating to me as chancellor, is some of the people who gave the most generous gifts to Berkeley were not Berkeley alums. And what they felt is they were so excited about the things that our scientists were doing that they wanted to fund that. And I think what we have to do is become better at making that case for the humanities. That's because philanthropy is so important a source. I also think that it's important to think about enrollments. There has been a real shift in enrollments away from the humanities toward the sciences at Berkeley. And so for the money the university has, it's enrollments that drive the funding formulas. So it's really important to do really attractive courses so that students continue to study the humanities.
Over there.
The general question was, within the English major, what's the prognosis, just either here at Berkeley or in the country as a whole?
That's such an interesting question. I've said this to you when we were in private conversation, but I'll say it to this larger audience. There was an article in the New Yorker a number of years ago, maybe some of you saw it, sort of the death of the English major. And it quoted lots of data for the argument in this article. But then there was this little parentheses in the article saying Berkeley is an exception to this trend. And the English major is fairly healthy. What's really fascinating to me is philosophy is one of the fastest growing majors. This student that I was talking to that I just mentioned a little while ago just added a philosophy major to his computer science major, saying, I really want to know about the big questions. The music major is exploding in its size. So it's not universally true of the humanities at Berkeley that they're in trouble. And one of the things that fascinates me about employers is there was a study, some of you may have read about this study that Google did a number of years ago, in which they studied the success in their company of people who came from technical backgrounds versus people who did not come from technical backgrounds. And they found that their employees who had majored in the humanities did rather better than their employees who majored in more technical subjects, which I found really fascinating. Because the humanities, you know this, what the humanities teach you is how to think, how to write, how to tell stories, how to read critically. And all those are so important for so many professions.
Over there.
I'm Jim Fisher, and everyone wants to be a creative writer or memoirist rather than studying the classics. But is there any, do you see that trend at Cal?
No, that trend isn't typical of Cal, in part because the department, a long time ago, made a decision about what the size of its creative writing offerings was going to be, and it doesn't have a creative writing major, for example. And Stanford's English program has been in trouble for a while. I don't know enough about it to understand really why that's the case. My sense is the creative writing program at Stanford was staffed by lecturers who are, they have many fewer rights in their jobs than do tenured faculty.
Isn't anyone going to ask about football? How much the... I'm just waiting, how much the coach gets paid.
Can I ask another
Sure.
question?
Sure.
So, let me ask about California students versus out of state and out of country. I know it's
There's been a huge decline in funding for not just the University of California, but state universities generally. Most states have sought to address that problem by increasing their percentage of out-of-state students. So, for example, the University of Michigan's 50%. That's true of University of Oregon, for example, University of Arizona. the University of California seems rather modest by that measure, but the state legislature is trying to get us to reduce that percentage from, Berkeley was about 24% out of state and international. Right. They want us to reduce to 18%. But that's a huge loss in income because a kind of secret of this is that the state, what state students pay for tuition, which is about $15,000, doesn't come close to covering the cost of education. What out-of-state students pay, which is, I think, someplace north of $40,000, it really subsidizes the state students. So it's really a question of state financing. I understand how upset families are in California if their kid can't get into Berkeley or UCLA or San Diego when they see out-of-state students there. I feel out-of-state and international students add a great deal to the student experience, and they often stay in California when they come here. I have a different point of view than certainly the state legislature and even than the office of the president. I think out-of-state students, within certain limits, are a good thing, and would like to see us not reduce, but that's a controversial point of view in some circles.
All right, one more question. Do we have a new person? Do we have a new person asking a question? Over here.
Do you have any comments on part-time and non-tenured faculty and what the trends are in terms of maybe a lot of baby boomer?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I just heard a presentation today about this, which really surprised me, which is, this was the whole University of California, but the percentage of non-tenure track faculty is about 25%, has been remarkably consistent for past decades, which really surprised me. I wouldn't have said that. So, and now there are strict limits on part-time faculty, so that you're guaranteed a review. It's called the eye of the needle review, and after that, if the course that you're teaching is not a replacement course for a faculty member that's on sabbatical, but continually taught by lecturers, you have develop a kind of almost contractual right in that position. So things have changed a bit. But I was really surprised by these statistics. I didn't expect it.
What about the role of football? I went to a college that didn't have any sports team. I don't think Smith had a football team, did they?
There was a T-shirt that I gave to my, at that point, very young niece when I was at Smith, and the front of it said Smith football, and the back of it said still undefeated. And my niece looked at this and she said, "Oh, Aunt Carol, you must be really good in football." But I mean, this is another, it's another question that could take the whole evening, like the Trump administration, that I so much regret the things that are happening in college athletics now. I think that it is losing its integrity and identity as amateur athletics. I think football is in the driver's seat. It's enormously expensive. And I very much regret what I see as a kind of professionalization of college sports with the name, image, likeness payments. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some very, very hard decisions coming up for Cal in regard to its sports. The world of college athletics is becoming almost unrecognizable to me. So it's as one of the many things I feel very happy to say, it's Chancellor Lyon's responsibility, not mine.
Okay, on that note, we're going to end this. Thank you very much. And there are refreshments, and we're going to give Chancellor Emerita complimentary membership in the club for
Thank you.
a full year.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I'll hand you a handbook. And
Thank
we'd
you.
love to see you come here more
Thank you.
often.
Thank you.
Okay, thank
well,
you.
I know this place very well because the Left Coast Chamber Ensemble does a lot of its
right,
concerts
right,
here.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
You can play. You're the yellow.
Oh, no.